rest your mind. The journey begins in silence. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. Most nights, history arrives loudly, with battles, with speeches, with men who wanted to be remembered. Tonight, history arrives quietly. It smells faintly of warm bread and old smoke, and it does not ask to be admired. This is a story about bread, which is another way of saying it is a story about endurance. Long before the city stirs, before carts rattle and chimneys begin their slow breathing, there is already someone awake. Not a guard, not a scholar, not a hero, just a baker, standing in the dark, waiting for heat to obey him. In Victorian England, mornings did not begin with sunlight. They began with labor, and few labors began as early or ended as tired as the making of bread. The baker does not wake because he loves dawn. He wakes because bread must exist by morning, whether he is ready or not. His body learns this rhythm before his mind does. The floor is cold, the air is stale. Somewhere nearby, a city is still pretending to sleep. Down below, in a basement that never fully dries, the day has already started. The bakery is not charming. It is not the place from postcards or nostalgia. It is a low room pressed into the earth where walls sweat and ceilings listen. There are no windows to speak of. Light enters reluctantly, if at all. Heat, however, is enthusiastic. It comes from a brick oven that does not negotiate. It roars when fed and sulks when ignored. It asks for coal, patience, and pieces of the baker's breath. There is no dial to measure temperature. The baker learns heat by instinct and by pain. Hands move quickly, arms withdraw when they must. The air thickens with soot and flour until breathing feels less like breathing and more like agreeing to continue. This is not a story of cruelty, exactly. No one designed it to be this way. It is simply the result of urgency layered on habit, habit layered on need. Bread is cheap, bread is filling, bread must be made. Everything else adjusts around that requirement, including bodies. Flour settles everywhere. It coats skin, hair, thoughts. It drifts into lungs and stays there, quietly, without asking permission. Sweat follows because heat demands it. The baker works without gloves because gloves would melt. He works without pauses because time does not soften for him. The oven must be fed. The dough must rise. Morning does not wait. The ingredients are ordinary only by name. Flour is flour until it is stretched, until it is whitened, until it becomes something that looks better than it behaves. The loaf must appear clean, even if the world around it is not. In Victorian England, appearances carried weight. A white loaf suggested safety. A dark one suggested poverty. And so, whiteness was encouraged, no matter the cost. This was not done with malice, it was done with economy. Chalk was cheap. Powdered substances had many uses. Boundaries between edible and useful were flexible. Customers did not ask questions. Hunger rarely does. Water arrives from wherever it can. It carries memories of places it passed through. It is not tested. It is trusted because it must be. Yeast is borrowed from brewing or from yesterday. Dough remembers previous days more than anyone else does. It rises slowly, as if considering whether the effort is worth it. There is a quiet irony in all of this. Bread, the simplest food, required one of the most complicated forms of endurance. It asked the baker to accept heat, dust, smoke, and uncertainty as part of a normal day. It asked him to pass these conditions on to others, indirectly wrapped in crust. The bakery is never clean, not because no one cares, but because there is no time for clean to matter. Rats find warmth where warmth exists. They move freely, confidently. They are not chased with urgency. They are understood as part of the environment, like damp walls or uneven floors. No one is surprised by them anymore. The baker's body adapts in small ways. Breathing becomes shallow. Movements become efficient. Discomfort becomes background noise. The day stretches long, not because it is dramatic, but because it is repetitive. Each loaf resembles the last. Each hour leans into the next. Time becomes something that happens to other people. And yet the bread emerges, warm, solid, reliable. It appears in windows and on tables. It fills stomachs. It quiets hunger. People trust it because they must. They do not see the basement. They do not feel the heat. They do not breathe the dust. This is not a story about villains. It is a story about systems that function just well enough to continue, about labor that disappears into routine, about danger that becomes ordinary through repetition. Victorian bakers did not think of themselves as martyrs. They thought of themselves as tired. And tiredness, when shared by everyone, becomes invisible. So tonight, as the world grows quieter, we step gently into that basement. Not to judge, not to dramatize, just to observe, to notice how something as soft as bread required something as hard as endurance, and to let the rhythm of that work slow our own breathing until history becomes less about noise and more about the steady, unnoticed effort of staying awake long enough for others to eat. This story is about the daily life of bakers in Victorian England during the 19th century, when cities expanded faster than comfort and progress often arrived without safety instructions. It focuses not on great inventions or famous reformers, but on the quiet mechanics of survival inside small basement bakeries scattered across rapidly growing urban neighborhoods. These were places where labor began before sunrise and ended long after exhaustion stopped being useful. The narrative explores the working conditions inside these bakeries: intense heat from coal-fired ovens, thick air filled with flour dust and soot, and constant physical strain that shaped bodies over years of repetition. It examines how food, particularly bread, was produced under economic pressure that encouraged adulteration, stretching ingredients beyond their original purpose. Cheap fillers, whitening agents, and contaminated water entered loaves not through cruelty, but through a system that prioritized affordability and appearance over long-term health. The story also touches on hygiene that barely existed, on rats and damp walls accepted as normal, and on child apprentices who entered the trade early, learning endurance before they learned choice. Bread appears here not only as nourishment, but as a quiet risk carried into every household, a daily staple that reflected the compromises of industrial society. All of this unfolds within the Victorian era, specifically the mid to late 19th century, roughly between 1840 and 1890. It is a period shaped by industrialization, rapid urban growth, and incomplete labor and food safety laws. Told in a calm, late-night tone, the story avoids heroics and outrage. Instead, it lingers on routine, on acceptance, and on how an entire society learned to live with danger by calling it normal. Chapter 1. Waking before the city agrees to exist. The day begins before the city is certain it wants to wake up, not with bells, not with voices, but with movement in the dark, slow and practiced, like a body remembering something the mind would rather forget. In Victorian London, morning does not announce itself. It leaks in quietly, through damp stone and tired lungs. Somewhere above, the streets are still undecided. Windows remain dark. Chimneys wait. The city is holding its breath. Below ground, however, someone is already awake. Not because he is eager, not because he is virtuous, simply because bread must exist by the time other people remember they are hungry. There is no alarm clock. There is no coffee waiting to soften the edges of consciousness. There is only habit, fatigue, and the unspoken agreement that the baker must rise first so others may rise comfortably later. His body moves before his thoughts do. Feet touch the cold floor. Shoulders lift without enthusiasm. The day begins without ceremony. He does not wake early because he is hard-working. That is a story told later by people who slept through this hour. He wakes because if he does not, the neighborhood will notice. And if the neighborhood notices, blame travels in a very predictable direction. Hunger is patient, but it is not forgiving. The room he leaves behind is small and quiet, still warm from the previous night's breath. He does not linger. There is nothing here that improves with attention. He dresses in silence, fabric stiff, with yesterday's flour and today's inevitability. Somewhere nearby, another body coughs. The sound does not invite concern anymore. It is simply part of the soundscape of morning. The walk to the bakery is short, but heavy. The streets are empty in a way that feels temporary, like a pause rather than peace. Gas lamps flicker, uncertain of their purpose. The air carries the memory of smoke even before anything is burning. London, at this hour, looks less like a city and more like a draft. The bakery waits below street level, where light arrives late and leaves early. The door opens with reluctance, wood complaining softly, as if it too resents being awake. Inside, the air is stale, thick with yesterday's heat and flour dust that never fully settles. This is not a place designed for comfort. It is designed for repetition. The oven dominates the room. It is already hungry. Brick and iron, patched and blackened, it stands like a creature that must be fed regularly, or it will sulk, or worse, explode into enthusiasm at the wrong moment. There is no gentle warmth here. Heat arrives fully formed, demanding attention and respect. The baker lights the fire without ceremony. He has done this before. He will do it again. Coal catches. Flame answers. The room begins to change. Cold retreats slowly, replaced by something more aggressive. Sweat appears before the work truly starts. This is the moment when the body commits to the day. The mind lags behind, still half asleep, still negotiating. But the hands are already moving. They know what comes next. They always do. Above ground, the city remains undecided. Down here, the decision has already been made. As the oven warms, The room fills with quiet activity. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just motion repeated often enough to become smooth. Flour sacks are opened. Wooden surfaces receive the first dusting of white. The baker breathes carefully, not out of caution, but habit. Too deep. And the air answers with coughing. Flour is everywhere before it is anywhere useful. It coats the floor, the table, the baker himself. It settles into hair and eyebrows, softening features into something pale and indistinct. Over time, it will also settle into lungs, but that is a concern for later years. For now, it simply exists, floating gently, refusing to stay put. The ingredients are simple in theory: flour, water, something to make it rise. In practice, each carries a history of compromise. Flour is stretched when it must be. Water arrives from wherever it can. Yeast remembers other days, other batches, passed along quietly, like an heirloom no one wanted to claim responsibility for. Nothing here is measured precisely. Experience replaces instruments. The baker knows the feel of dough the way others know handwriting. Too dry, and it resists. Too wet, and it collapses into itself. The balance is found not through numbers, but through touch. And touch is not always reliable this early. There is no conversation. If others are present, they move silently, conserving words for later hours. Sound travels poorly in this room anyway, absorbed by brick and heat. The oven hums low, satisfied for now. The floor is already warm, underfoot. Time behaves strangely here. Minutes stretch, not because they are long, but because they are empty of variety. Each action resembles the last. Each movement leads to another identical movement. The day unfolds without landmarks. Only the gradual brightening of the room signals progress. Sweat appears quickly now, not dramatic, just persistent. Clothing clings. Skin learns to tolerate heat by surrendering to it. This is not suffering in the theatrical sense. It is discomfort normalized through repetition. The body adapts because it must. Occasionally, the baker pauses, leaning briefly against the table, not to rest, but to reset. Breathing becomes shallow, efficient. The air is thick with particles too small to see, but impossible to ignore. Somewhere in the walls, something moves. It is not acknowledged. The dough rises slowly, indifferent to human schedules. It takes its time as if considering whether the effort is worthwhile. The baker waits without impatience. Waiting is part of the work. Waiting, like heat, becomes familiar. There is a quiet irony in all of this. Bread, the most ordinary of foods, requires an extraordinary amount of tolerance to produce. It demands early mornings, heavy air, and hands willing to work before the rest of the body has agreed to be present. Above ground, light begins to touch windows. Somewhere, a door opens. A cart rattles past. The city is beginning to make up its mind. Down here, the baker notices only because the room changes color slightly. The day outside is someone else's concern. The first loaves are shaped without ceremony. There is no pride in this stage, only accuracy. They are placed carefully, not gently. The oven waits, mouth open, ready to receive what it was promised. This is still the beginning. The long part comes later. For now, the baker continues, steady and unremarkable, carrying the weight of mourning so others do not have to. When the loaves enter the oven, something close to silence settles. The fire does its work without commentary. The baker watches, not with anticipation, but with familiarity. This moment is less about hope and more about confirmation. If the oven behaves, the day will continue as planned. If it does not, the day will become complicated. Heat presses outward, filling the room with a presence that cannot be ignored. The baker steps back slightly, adjusting position by instinct. Skin tightens, breath shortens. The body learns these negotiations early in life. By now they are automatic. This is the hour when the city finally wakes. Somewhere above, people stretch, yawn, and complain about mornings. They do not know that their comfort has already been negotiated on their behalf. They will not consider the air below their feet, or the hands that shaped what they will soon eat. And that is perhaps the point. Bread does not arrive with a story attached. It appears warm and solid on counters and tables. It is trusted because it is familiar. No one asks how it came to be. Questions belong to luxuries. Hunger accepts what it is given. The baker wipes his hands on his apron, leaving pale streaks that will never fully disappear. He does not think of this as labor. He thinks of it as time passing in a particular way. His body will remember this hour later when joints complain and breathing becomes effort. For now, there is only the present task. The oven door opens. Heat rushes out, eager, almost offended to be contained. The baker leans in, careful but unafraid. Fear would slow him down. He has learned what the oven can do. He has learned where not to stand. The loaves darken gradually, their surfaces changing color in a way that suggests completion, even if nothing here is ever truly finished. The smell of bread fills the room, warm and reassuring in a way that feels slightly dishonest. It promises comfort without revealing cost. There is a moment, brief and easily missed, when the baker allows himself to notice this. The smell, the warmth, the idea that something useful is being made. It does not last long. Utility is not sentimental. Soon there will be more batches, more heat, more hours. This first cycle is simply the opening note, quiet and persistent. The real work stretches far ahead, waiting patiently. Above ground, the city has decided to exist. Shops will open, voices will rise, breakfast will be served. Down here, the baker continues, unremarkable and necessary, part of a system that functions because it does not stop to ask how it feels. This is not a heroic beginning. It does not announce itself. It simply happens again and again, before dawn, beneath the streets, in rooms that never quite cool. And as the loaves are removed, set aside to cool, the baker moves on without pause. The day has agreed to begin. He has already been awake long enough to know that this was never in question. Chapter 2. The Basement, where bread is born. The bakery does not sit proudly on the street. It hides, it sinks. It rests below the level of ordinary footsteps, as if it knows that what happens inside is not meant to be admired in daylight. If you walk past the building at noon, you might notice nothing more than a plain door and a small sign, the kind that promises bread with the modest confidence of someone who has never seen the room where it is made. To enter, you go down. A short stair, worn at the edges, leading into air that feels older than the morning. The temperature changes first. Street cold becomes basement damp. Then the smell arrives. Coal smoke, stale flour, and something faintly sour like yesterday's work still speaking under its breath. The light follows last, and it is not generous. It slips in behind you and seems to regret the decision. There are no windows, not the kind that open, not the kind that even pretend. Ventilation is a rumor, a story people tell themselves so they can keep doing what they are already doing. The room is built for containment. Heat stays. Smoke lingers. Voices soften because the walls are too close to allow anything loud to feel polite. The oven dominates everything. It is brick, blackened, patched, and temperamental. It does not look like a tool. It looks like a resident, a large, hungry tenant that must be fed regularly or it will become offended. Coal goes in, heat comes out. The exchange is simple, except for the part where the heat does not stop when you ask it to. In this basement, the oven is the sun and the baker is a planet, doing his best not to drift too close. The day's comfort depends on a balance that is learned through small burns and careful distance. The baker knows which stones stay hot longer, which corners trap smoke, which drafts are imaginary. He knows how to move without wasting air. When the fire is strong, the room becomes a steady pressure. Skin warms, then sweats, then forgets what cool felt like. Clothing clings, hair dampens. The baker's hands become pale with flour and dark with soot, like they are trying to belong to two different worlds at once. Above ground, people imagine a bakery as warm and inviting. Down here, warmth is not an invitation. It is a demand. The floor is always slightly sticky, not dramatically, not like a spilled drink, just enough to remind you that this is a place where sugar and grease and time have agreed to live together. The ceiling is low enough to make tall men adopt a permanent posture of caution. The walls hold stains that do not have stories anymore, only presence. And yet the work continues with quiet steadiness. The basement does not permit romance, it permits repetition. The baker does not dream in here, he calculates, he listens to the oven's mood. He measures heat the old way, with the back of the hand, with the speed of a flinch, with the quiet promise that he will be careful next time. Victorian London calls this a workplace. The body calls it a threshold. You cross it every morning, and the room teaches you gently and relentlessly what your limits are. Sometimes it teaches you again, just to be sure. For a moment, he rests his palm on the wooden table and feels it warming through the grain. Even the furniture learns to endure. He exhales, slow, and the room answers with another quiet, patient wave of heat anyway. As the hours move forward, the basement changes shape without moving. It feels smaller, not because the walls have shifted, but because heat expands into every corner and takes up space like a confident guest. Air becomes something you notice. You begin to take it in the way you take in heavy fabric, slowly, carefully, aware that too much at once will make you uncomfortable. Flour dust floats through the room in a soft, constant snowfall. In better lighting, it might look beautiful, almost peaceful, like winter. Down here, it looks like what it is. Work made airborne. It settles on shelves, on shoulders, on eyelashes. It lands on the tongue with a dry little bitterness, a reminder that bread is never only bread at the moment it is being made. The oven breathes. It does not breathe cleanly. It exhales smoke that clings to surfaces and to lungs. The baker learns to cough quietly, as if politeness might improve the air. He wipes sweat from his face with a sleeve that immediately becomes damp again. In this room, moisture is a cycle. You lose it, you regain it, you lose it again. There is a strange intimacy in a basement bakery, not the kind shared between friends, but the kind created by proximity. Everyone is too close to the same heat, the same dust, the same tiredness. If there is an apprentice, the apprentice learns quickly that the basement has its own rules. Speak less. Move faster. Do not stand where the oven door swings. Do not lean on that brick. Do not trust your sense of time, because time behaves differently when your day began before the sky had color. Tools are simple: wooden troughs, cloths, scrapers, peels. Nothing gleams, nothing looks new. Wood holds the memory of dough. Cloth holds the memory of hands. The baker's apron becomes a map of the morning, pale smears from flour, darker marks from soot, small damp patches where the body tried to cool itself and failed. Sometimes, cold air sneaks in when the door opens. It feels like a small miracle, and then it disappears, as if embarrassed by its own generosity. The baker does not chase it. He only notices briefly that the outside world exists, with its streets and shop fronts and people who complain about ordinary things like being slightly late. Down here, late has a different meaning. Late is when the dough did not rise. Late is when the fire weakened. Late is when the first customer arrives and the bread is not ready, and disappointment turns quickly into accusation. Hunger may be patient, but it can be sharply spoken. The basement also contains its own quiet population. Mice, perhaps. Rats, likely. They like warmth. They like grain. They like a world where humans are too tired to be surprised. The baker notices signs and adapts in small ways, moving sacks, closing lids, sweeping crumbs. There is no grand battle for cleanliness, only a steady negotiation between what is ideal and what is possible at 4 in the morning. If you listen carefully, you can hear the street waking above. Footsteps, a cart, a shout. The baker hears it too, but it feels distant, like someone else's life. His world is this room, this heat, this constant gentle pressure. The basement is where bread is born, and like many births, it is not particularly tidy. If you could see the baker's thoughts, they would look like flour in lamplight, drifting, settling, drifting again. Nothing sharp, nothing heroic, just deciding to keep going, one breath at a time. By the time the first loaves are ready, the basement has fully claimed the baker's attention. The oven's glow paints the walls with a soft, flickering light that feels almost kind until you remember what it costs to keep it burning. The baker slides the peel under a loaf with practiced ease. The crust is forming. The smell is warm and comforting, which is an impressive trick for a room that otherwise specializes in discomfort. This is where the quiet irony becomes clearest. Above ground, people associate bread with calm, breakfast tables, simple meals, the soothing certainty of something familiar. Down here, calm is not the atmosphere. Calm is the skill. The baker must remain steady while heat presses close and the air stays heavy. He must be gentle with dough while being ungentle with the fire. He must keep moving even when every part of him suggests stopping would be reasonable. When the oven door opens, heat rushes out like an eager animal. The baker steps aside at exactly the right moment, not because he is brave, but because he has learned that bravery is not useful here. Timing is useful. Distance is useful. A small turn of the shoulder can save skin. A remembered rhythm can save a day. E checks the loaves without ceremony. There is no applause for a good batch. There is only the quiet relief that it worked this time. The loaves emerge, set on boards, cooling in air that is never truly cool. They crackle softly as they settle. That sound is small, almost intimate, like a whisper of completion. And then the cycle begins again. More dough, more shaping, more feeding of the oven. The basement does not reward you with a finish line, it rewards you with continuity. The baker's work is not a single achievement. It is a series of nearly identical moments, each one requiring attention, each one disappearing as soon as it is done. If you are looking for drama, the basement refuses to provide it. The drama is too ordinary. It lives in small hazards, a coal that falls, a sleeve that comes too close to flame, a moment of dizziness that passes if you pretend it does. The baker becomes an expert in pretending. Pretending he is not too hot. Pretending the air is fine. Pretending that tiredness is just another ingredient to be stirred in and ignored. And yet there is something quietly human about this place. The baker knows the oven's moods the way someone might know a pet's habits. He listens for changes in sound. He watches for shifts in smoke. He adjusts without complaint, because complaint wastes breath, and breath is already precious. When morning fully arrives above ground, the basement feels unchanged. It remains dim, warm, and close. But the baker knows time has moved because bread has moved. Loaves leave the room. Coins arrive. People eat. The city continues, supported by work it rarely sees. Victorian London called this progress. It called it industry. It called it the price of feeding millions. The body, meanwhile, simply called it heat, dust, and endurance, repeated daily until it became normal. The basement does not ask you to admire it. It only asks you to step down, breathe carefully, and understand that even comfort can have a hidden address. Outside, someone will call this loaf ordinary. Down here, ordinary takes skill. It takes wrists that remember, lungs that negotiate, and a calm that is practiced like a song sung softly in a room that never quite cools. The baker keeps singing tonight. Chapter 3. Flour and the Meaning of Edible. Flour in Victorian England was rarely just flour. That simple word suggested purity, grain, and nourishment, but reality preferred negotiation. Every sack of flour carried quiet conversations between cost, appearance, and survival, none of which asked permission from the body that would eventually receive it. What mattered most was not what flour was, but what it could convincingly pretend to be. In theory, flour came from wheat. In practice, wheat was expensive, unpredictable, and sometimes inconvenient. Demand was constant. Bread was expected daily, reliably, and cheaply. The solution was not invention, but adjustment. Flour became something that could be stretched, lightened, and persuaded into meeting expectations that grain alone could not satisfy. To the Victorian customer, whiteness meant quality. A pale loaf suggested refinement, cleanliness, and trustworthiness. Dark bread carried uncomfortable associations with poverty and scarcity, and so the color of flour became more important than its honesty. If it looked clean, it was assumed to be safe. If it was safe, it deserved to be eaten. The logic was elegant in its simplicity, even if the body disagreed later. Chalk was one such adjustment. It was inexpensive, plentiful, and pleasingly white. Ground finely enough, it blended easily, disappearing into the flour without complaint. Bone dust followed similar logic. It was readily available, already processed by other industries, and pale enough to improve appearances. Ground earth, carefully sifted, joined the mixture when needed. None of these were chosen for taste or nourishment. They were chosen because they behaved. No one involved paused to label this as deception. That word implies intent and guilt, and neither were particularly useful in a system built on endurance. This was described instead as economic reality. Flour had to be affordable, bread had to be sold. Bakers worked within margins so narrow they often disappeared entirely. Stretching ingredients was not cleverness. It was survival, dressed as practicality. The flour did not protest. It accepted its additions quietly. When mixed with water, it still formed dough. When placed near heat, it still rose. When baked, it still became bread. To the eye, the process appeared successful. To the stomach, it became a longer conversation. Victorian society valued appearance deeply. Cleanliness, even symbolic cleanliness, mattered. The industrial city was loud, crowded, and visibly dirty. Against that backdrop, a white loaf felt reassuring, almost moral. It suggested order. It suggested care. It suggested that at least this part of daily life was under control. The irony, gentle and persistent, was that this concern for surface purity traveled directly into the body. The same substances added to improve trust entered stomachs without debate. The loaf looked better. The consequences arrived later, quietly and without witnesses. For the baker, flour was a material, not a philosophy. He worked with what he was given. Sacks arrived already blended, already negotiated. His task was not to question, but to produce. The oven did not ask what was in the dough, neither did hunger. In this way, flour became a mirror of the age, industrial, compromised, and functional enough to continue. It did not nourish perfectly, it nourished adequately, and adequacy in Victorian England was often considered success. Once flour entered the bakery, its identity became even more flexible. It absorbed moisture, heat, and intention without complaint. Mixed in wooden troughs, worn smooth by decades of hands, it became dough through repetition rather than precision. Measurements were suggestions. Texture was authority. The baker trusted his fingers more than labels he had never seen. Water joined the mixture from whatever source was nearest. It carried the quiet history of its journey, but no one asked it to explain itself. Clean water was a luxury unevenly distributed. Bread did not wait for luxuries. It accepted what arrived. As the dough came together, it carried within it the results of many small decisions made elsewhere. Decisions about cost, transport, storage, and appearance all met here, in a warm, dim room, where the baker leaned over his work, breathing carefully. The dough rose, indifferent to its contents. It responded to warmth and time, not purity. Customers rarely considered these details. They judged bread by weight, color, and price. A loaf that felt substantial inspired confidence. A loaf that looked pale inspired trust. These qualities were easier to measure than safety and far easier than long-term consequence. Bread was expected to satisfy hunger, not curiosity. There is something quietly impressive about how well this system functioned. Millions were fed daily. Loaves appeared on tables across the city with dependable regularity. The machine worked, even if some of its parts quietly wore down the people inside it. The baker's role in this system was strangely distant from its effects. He did not eat most of what he made. He sold it. He touched the dough, shaped it, baked it, and sent it upward into the world. What happened afterward belonged to someone else. Responsibility, like flour, could be stretched. Occasionally, rumors circulated. Bread that tasted strange, bread that upset stomachs, bread that felt heavier than expected. These complaints drifted through neighborhoods without gathering momentum. Illness had many explanations. Bread was familiar. Familiar things are rarely questioned. The baker learned to ignore gossip. He had fires to manage and time to chase. Flour dust settled into his lungs, whether he worried or not. His body carried its own quiet ledger of costs. It did not need additional concern. Victorian life was full of such compromises. Cities grew faster than understanding. Industries expanded faster than safeguards. People adapted by narrowing their expectations. Food that did not immediately harm was considered successful. Effects that unfolded slowly were assigned to fate, weakness, or bad luck. Flour, once a simple product, became a participant in this broader arrangement. It was no longer just ground grain. It was an agreement, an understanding that perfection was unnecessary, that appearance could stand in for safety, and that tomorrow would be addressed when it arrived. There is a soft, almost musical rhythm to this kind of thinking. It allows daily life to continue without constant alarm. It permits sleep. It permits repetition. It permits a city to feed itself without stopping to consider how fragile the balance truly is. In the bakery, the dough waits, the baker wipes his hands, the oven warms. No one speaks of chalk or bone or earth. Those words are too specific for a system that prefers generalities. Bread is bread, flour is flour, and anything beyond that can wait until later. Later, however, has a habit of arriving quietly, long after the loaf is gone. When the bread is finally baked, it looks reassuring. The crust forms evenly. The color is pale enough to satisfy expectation, dark enough to suggest substance. It cools on wooden boards, releasing a familiar scent that travels easily, smoothing over questions before they form. Smell has always been persuasive. This is the moment when flour completes its transformation. Whatever compromises it carried are sealed inside warmth and routine. The loaf becomes ordinary. It enters kitchens, baskets, and hands that trust it without conversation. It is sliced, shared, and consumed as part of daily life. Unremarkable in the way necessities often are. The baker watches this moment without attachment. For him, the loaf is finished when it leaves the basement. Its story ends at the door. Another batch waits. Another negotiation begins. The rhythm does not pause long enough for reflection. Victorian society understood this arrangement intuitively. Life required constant adjustment. Food was one of many things managed imperfectly. The focus remained on continuity rather than correction. As long as bread existed, tomorrow, today had been successful. There is a gentle, unsettling humor in this. A culture so invested in appearances accepted that the appearance of nourishment was close enough to nourishment itself. The loaf looked clean, therefore it was clean. It tasted familiar, therefore it was safe. The body's quieter objections took longer to translate. Flour, as an idea, became elastic. It meant what it needed to mean in order to function. This flexibility allowed cities to grow, bakeries to operate, and families to eat without constant interruption. It also ensured that discomfort would be distributed slowly, unevenly, and without clear cause. For the baker, flour was never philosophical. It was heavy, it was dusty, it irritated skin and lungs, it filled the room and followed him home in the folds of his clothing. He brushed it from his sleeves at night, leaving pale traces on chairs and floors. Even rest carried reminders of work. If there was irony, it was quiet enough to blend into fatigue. The baker produced sustenance while his own body absorbed the less visible ingredients of the process. Flour fed the city and settled into him at the same time, patient and unassuming. As night approaches again, the bakery empties. The oven cools reluctantly. The room exhales. Tomorrow's flour waits in sacks, already negotiated, already decided. The baker leaves without ceremony, carrying with him the fine white dust of the day. Above ground, families eat. They break bread. They feel full. The loaf has done its job. No one thinks about chalk or bone or ground earth. Those details remain where they belong, buried inside routine. This is how systems endure, not through cruelty, but through normalization. Not through ignorance, but through selective attention. Flour becomes edible because it must be. Bread becomes trusted because it appears to be. And so the day closes, gently, without resolution. The question of what is truly edible lingers only briefly before sleep arrives. Tomorrow will answer it the same way today did, quietly, adequately, and just convincingly enough to continue. Chapter 4: When Chemistry Slipped into Breakfast. There was a moment in Victorian history when chemistry quietly took a seat at the breakfast table. It did not announce itself, it did not wear a label, it did not introduce credentials or warnings. It simply arrived, folded into flour, baked into bread, and accepted without conversation. This was not an age that asked ingredients to explain themselves. Alum was one of the first guests. It entered the bakery as a helper, a small addition with a large promise. Added to flour, it made bread whiter, lighter, and more reliable in appearance. Dough rose more obediently. Crumbs looked softer. Loaves seemed refined, as if they belonged to a calmer, cleaner world than the one outside the bakery door. No one paused to ask what alum might do inside the body. Not in 5 years, not in 10. The future was an abstract concept. When the present demanded affordable bread, alum did its job quickly and visibly. That was enough to earn trust. In a society shaped by soot and crowding, anything that looked clean was welcomed warmly. The baker did not measure alum with suspicion. He measured it with habit. A pinch here, a little more there, not to deceive, but to survive competition. Customers preferred white bread sold. The logic was direct and unromantic. The oven did not care what was mixed into the dough. Heat treated all ingredients equally. Alum had no taste worth noticing. It blended quietly. Bread still smelled like bread. It still filled stomachs. If discomfort followed, it arrived slowly, disguised as ordinary illness. Stomach pains were common. Weakness was familiar. The body had many complaints, and bread was rarely the prime suspect. Chemistry worked best when it remained invisible. Alum succeeded because it did not announce itself. It behaved like an ingredient rather than a substance with consequences. Victorian bread did not sparkle or smoke. It simply looked better than it might have otherwise. The idea that food might cause long-term harm was still finding its language. Illness was often blamed on constitution, weather, or fatigue. The connection between repeated exposure and gradual damage was faint, easy to dismiss. Alum did not kill dramatically. It eroded quietly. The baker's hands mixed dough day after day, unaware that chemistry had become a partner in the process. He trusted what worked. He trusted what sold. There was no room in the basement for theory, only practice mattered, and so alum settled into routine. It became part of the morning without becoming part of the conversation. Bread arrived looking dependable. People ate. Life continued. This was how chemistry entered breakfast, not through innovation but through convenience, not through intention but through acceptance. It slipped in gently, carrying the promise of reliability, and stayed because no one asked it to leave. If alum was invited quietly, arsenic arrived by accident. It was not intended for bread. It had other jobs: bright colors, pest control, industrial usefulness. But Victorian storage habits were casual, and boundaries between substances were flexible. Sacks were reused, shelves were shared, containers remembered their past poorly. Arsenic did not come with a warning. It came with familiarity. Green dyes, especially, were popular, vibrant, and everywhere. They colored fabrics, wallpapers, and powders. Sometimes they colored sacks that would later hold flour or sugar. Sometimes residue remained. Sometimes no one noticed. The baker did not order arsenic. He did not sprinkle it deliberately. It arrived because systems overlapped, and no one felt responsible for the space between them. Goods moved quickly. Storage rooms were crowded. Labels were inconsistent. Trust filled the gaps. When arsenic entered bread, it did so politely. There was no immediate drama, no flames, no obvious change in texture. Bread baked as usual. It tasted slightly different, perhaps. Metallic, maybe. But taste was subjective, and hunger forgave many things. Illness followed in ways that were difficult to trace: nausea, weakness, pallor, hair thinning. Symptoms that belonged comfortably among the many discomforts of urban life. Work was hard. Air was bad. Water was questionable. Bread did not stand out as the villain. The baker remained unaware. He was too busy managing heat, time, and demand. His day was full before dawn. His attention did not extend to the chemistry of pigments or the habits of warehouses. Bread left his hands warm and whole. That felt like success. Victorian systems rarely accounted for accidents that unfolded slowly. A sudden fire demanded response. A gradual poisoning blended into background suffering. Arsenic did not shout. It whispered patiently across many meals. And so it stayed undetected for longer than seems possible, in hindsight. The idea that something used to kill rats might also be entering bread was uncomfortable. Discomfort was easier to ignore than hunger. There is something darkly humorous in this arrangement. A society deeply concerned with appearances allowed unseen substances to pass freely as long as surfaces remained pleasing. Bread looked safe, therefore it was safe. Anything beyond that was speculation. Chemistry did not need permission, it only needed opportunity. Shared spaces, reused containers, busy hands, tired minds. Victorian England provided all of these generously. Arsenic's presence was not proof of malice, it was proof of indifference. Systems that prioritize speed and affordability over separation will eventually mix things that were never meant to meet. By the time patterns emerged, many loaves had already been eaten, many meals had passed. Bread had done its job, and so had arsenic, quietly and without fanfare. From a distance, it might seem shocking that chemistry was allowed such freedom. Up close, it feels inevitable. Victorian bread existed at the intersection of demand, appearance, and endurance. Chemistry simply filled the spaces left open by urgency. Alum smoothed inconsistencies. Arsenic slipped through negligence. Neither required conspiracy. The baker continued his work with steady hands. He judged success by loaves sold, not by long-term outcomes he could not see. Responsibility was fragmented, distributed across suppliers, storage rooms, transport routes, and habits inherited without question. Bread remained central. It fed families. It anchored meals. It symbolized stability in a city defined by change. Questioning bread felt like questioning survival itself. Few were eager to do that before breakfast. There is a gentle irony here, suitable for late-night reflection. Victorian bread was not designed to harm. It was designed to reassure. White loaves suggested progress. Consistent texture suggested control. Chemistry helped maintain these illusions efficiently. The body, however, does not care for illusion. It responds to accumulation. Alum and arsenic worked slowly, patiently, as bodies absorbed what they were given. Effects emerged gradually, blending into the general fatigue of working life. When reformers eventually raised concerns, they faced skepticism. Bread had always been bread. Bakers had always baked. To suggest danger felt disruptive, impolite. The breakfast table was not a place for chemistry lessons. Still, questions began to surface, not loudly, not all at once, but persistently. Why did some loaves upset stomachs more than others? Why did illness cluster? Why did animals refuse scraps humans consumed without hesitation? These questions did not immediately change habits, but they lingered. They unsettled comfort. They introduced doubt into routines that had depended on trust. Victorian bread, it turns out, was not trying to kill anyone. It simply did not care what happened afterward. It performed its role efficiently and moved on. That indifference was not moral. It was structural. Chemistry, once introduced, rarely leaves quietly. It becomes part of the process, invisible until someone learns how to see it. In Victorian bakeries, that learning came slowly, pushed by accumulated discomfort, rather than sudden catastrophe. As night returns and kitchens fall silent, the story of chemistry and bread feels less like a scandal and more like a lesson whispered too late. Systems that value appearance over understanding invite quiet consequences. Meals that arrive reliably are trusted automatically. The baker closes his shop. The oven cools. Tomorrow's flour waits. Chemistry remains folded into routine, patient and unremarkable. Somewhere above, families sleep, satisfied by dinner. Bread has done its work. Chemistry has done its own. Neither announces the difference. This is how danger survives inside normality. Not with drama, but with calm. Not with intent, but with habit. And that is perhaps the most unsettling thing to carry with us into sleep. Chapter 5. Hygiene. An idea not yet invented. In the Victorian bakery, cleanliness was not a principle. It was a future suggestion. The room did not reject hygiene out of cruelty or ignorance. It simply had no space for it. Heat demanded priority. Time demanded speed. Bread demanded completion. Everything else waited patiently, often forever. The baker worked stripped down by necessity rather than choice. Shirts were removed because fabric trapped heat and slowed movement. Skin was exposed not as freedom but as adaptation. Sweat appeared quickly and continuously, tracing familiar paths down arms and backs, falling without ceremony into flour, already prepared to accept it. Flour clung to everything. It softened skin, lightened hair, and blurred the line between body and work. The baker did not brush it away often. There was no point. Within minutes it would return. Hands pressed dough, dough pressed back. Contact was constant, intimate, and unquestioned. There were no gloves. Gloves reduced sensation and melted too easily near the oven. There were no masks. Masks would have made breathing even harder in air already heavy with dust and smoke. Protection was considered optional when survival required efficiency. No one asked whether sweat belonged in bread. No one asked whether skin should meet dough so directly. Questions slowed production. Production fed people. The logic felt complete. The bakery floor carried years of residue. Sugar, grease, moisture. Footsteps pressed these elements together into a surface that was never truly clean and never entirely dry. Brooms passed over it occasionally, rearranging rather than removing what lived there. The walls watched without comment. They held stains that no one remembered creating. In a different context, these marks might have been alarming. Here, they were simply part of the background, like the hum of the oven or the ache in the baker's wrists. Rodents did not hide. They did not need to. Warmth attracted them, grain sustained them. They moved confidently through the space, familiar with human patterns. A rat crossing the floor did not interrupt work. It was acknowledged perhaps and then ignored. In time, the rats felt less like intruders and more like unpaid staff. They appeared regularly. They knew where crumbs fell. They understood schedules. Their presence was inconvenient but predictable, which in a Victorian bakery was often good enough. The baker adjusted habits rather than environments. Sacks were lifted slightly, boards were stored higher, traps appeared occasionally, offering the illusion of control. None of this aimed at purity. It aimed at continuation. Customers did not see this room. They saw loaves stacked neatly, pale and warm, offered with practiced confidence. Bread emerged from the basement transformed, stripped of its context. That transformation was essential. The story of how bread was made would not have improved appetite. The baker did not reflect on hygiene. He reflected on timing, on heat, on weight. Cleanliness belonged to another world, one with more light and fewer deadlines. Here, bread was made first. Everything else remained theoretical. Hygiene as a concept requires distance. It asks people to step back, to observe, to imagine consequences beyond the immediate task. The Victorian bakery allowed little distance. Bodies worked close together, close to heat, close to surfaces already claimed by work. There was no room to step away and consider. Sweat continued to fall. It mixed easily with flour, indistinguishable once absorbed. The baker wiped his face with a forearm that was already dusted white. The gesture changed nothing. Moisture returned quickly. The room made sure of that. Cuts and burns were common. Small injuries accumulated without ceremony. A nick from a blade, a blister from heat, a scrape from rough wood. These were not emergencies. They were expected. Hands carried them into dough without pause. There was no system for washing beyond what water happened to be available. Cold water, if present, numbed fingers briefly and then vanished. Soap existed, but it was not abundant, and it was not prioritized during working hours. Clean hands were less important than fast hands. Rodents continued their routines. They moved through corners and shadows, occasionally brushing against sacks or boards. Their presence did not shock anyone in a city where animals and people shared space closely. Rats were simply part of the arrangement. There is a quiet absurdity in how normal this felt. Modern minds imagine alarm, disgust, outrage. Victorian bakers imagined breakfast. Hunger made many accommodations seem reasonable. Customers, for the most part, remained unaware. Bread reached them wrapped in familiarity. The crust cracked pleasantly. The crumb felt soft. The loaf smelled comforting. These signals overpowered curiosity. And even if someone suspected unpleasant details, Suspicion rarely translated into refusal. Bread was too central. Alternatives were limited. Hunger does not encourage standards. There is a kind of dark humor here, gentle enough to surface only in hindsight. An entire system relied on not knowing too much. Knowledge would have complicated meals. Ignorance kept schedules intact. The baker did not think of himself as unsanitary. He thought of himself as tired. Tiredness absorbs many concerns. When exhaustion becomes routine, discomfort feels like background noise. In this environment, hygiene was not rejected. It was postponed. Perhaps tomorrow. Perhaps later. Perhaps when things slowed down. They never did. The bakery operated on a principle of acceptable risk, though no one used those words. If bread fed the neighborhood and no one collapsed immediately, the day was successful. Subtler harms were assigned to chance. In the evenings, the baker brushed flour from his clothing, leaving pale trails behind. He carried the bakery with him into sleep, into rooms that smelled faintly of work. Even rest was never fully clean. Hygiene would arrive eventually as an idea with language and enforcement. But here, in this room, it remained unborn. Bread was made anyway. Life continued anyway. Looking back, it is tempting to judge the Victorian bakery harshly, but judgment requires distance, and distance was precisely what this system lacked. Every decision was made close to heat, close to hunger, close to consequence. The baker did not have the luxury of abstraction. Sweat, flour, and skin continued to mix as they always had. Rats continued their quiet patrols. The room continued to operate as a shared ecosystem rather than a controlled environment. No one paused to label it unhealthy. It was simply how things were done. There is something unsettlingly calm about that acceptance. The bakery did not feel chaotic, it felt routine. Routines are powerful. They normalize conditions that would otherwise demand change. Customers trusted what they received. Bread filled bellies. Meals happened on time. Children ate. Workers continued. The system worked well enough to justify itself. And even if someone knew, truly knew, what happened below ground, the outcome might not have changed. Hunger is persuasive. It makes compromises feel sensible. It encourages silence. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson hygiene teaches when it finally arrives. That absence of cleanliness is not always ignorance. Sometimes it is necessity, wrapped in habit and reinforced by survival. Victorian society was not uniquely careless. It was constrained. It grew faster than its understanding of consequence. It solved problems in the order they appeared. Feeding people came before protecting them. The baker did not consider himself careless. He considered himself responsible. Responsible for showing up early. Responsible for producing enough. Responsible for not letting the oven fail. These responsibilities filled the day completely. Hygiene would require new responsibilities, new pauses, new questions. Those would come later, carried by reformers and laws and outrage. For now, the bakery remained unchanged. At night, the room cooled slightly, the oven slept. The rats adjusted schedules, flour settled into corners. Tomorrow would repeat itself faithfully. Above ground, families slept after eating. Bread had done its work. No one dreamed of basements or sweat or small movements in the dark. Sleep arrived easily. This is how unsanitary systems persist. Not through malice, but through adequacy. They do enough to continue, and continuation becomes justification. Hygiene, when it finally arrives, will feel obvious. It will feel overdue. But here, in this chapter of history, it remains only a shadow of a future idea. The baker locks the door, the street forgets him. Inside, the room waits patiently, unchanged, ready to produce comfort again tomorrow, using methods no one is eager to inspect too closely. And that is perhaps the quietest irony of all, that something as nourishing as bread could be born so far from cleanliness, sustained not by care, but by endurance, repetition, and the simple, undeniable force of hunger. Chapter 6. When bread began to push back. At some point, the bakery stops being passive. It does not rebel loudly. It does not announce its intentions. It simply reacts. Flour hangs in the air long enough to remember that it is not only soft, but flammable. Heat lingers near wood that has learned to dry too well. Sparks exist. That is all it takes. The baker does not think of danger in abstract terms. He thinks in habits. He thinks in routines, refined by exhaustion. He feeds the oven. He moves quickly. He sweeps when he can. Fire is familiar. It has always been there. Familiar things feel less threatening even when they are. Flour dust drifts invisibly until light catches it. In that moment, it resembles mist, harmless, almost gentle. But mist made of grain remembers its origin. It waits for heat. It waits for friction. It waits without impatience. When ignition happens, it is sudden and strangely quiet at first. A flash, a pressure shift. Then sound arrives. Not a dramatic roar, but a deep thud, as if the room itself flinched. Boards shake, air moves fast. The baker reacts before thought arrives. Small fires start often. They are treated like inconveniences rather than warnings. A corner darkens, a beam smolders. Someone stamps it out, someone laughs. The day continues. In Victorian London, bakeries burned more than once, not always completely, sometimes only partially. Enough to damage, not enough to stop. Repairs were quick and minimal. Charred beams stayed in place. Soot became part of the decor. No one called this a disaster. Disaster implies interruption. These fires were incorporated into routine like illness or broken tools. You lost time, you rebuilt, you returned. Wooden floors absorbed years of heat, oil, and flour. They did not resist flame enthusiastically. They glowed quietly beneath feet. Smoke curled upward without urgency. Breathing became difficult, but breathing was already difficult. Some bakers died from smoke, not dramatically, not memorably. They inhaled enough, often over years, and then one morning they did not wake. The bakery continued. Accidents happened. A slip, a collapse. A hand caught where it should not have been. These were not framed as tragedies. They were framed as costs. Every trade had them. The bakery did not feel hostile. It felt indifferent. Indifference is more unsettling than malice. The room did not target anyone. It simply obeyed physics while people pretended otherwise. Bread continued to be made. Fire, after all, was still necessary. Without it, nothing rose, nothing baked, nothing fed the neighborhood. Risk was accepted as part of nourishment. The baker learned to move faster when sparks appeared. He learned to recognize the smell of wood that had crossed a threshold. These skills were not written down. They lived in muscle memory. This is where bread begins to push back. Not with intention, not with anger, but with quiet consequences that accumulate until bodies fail to adapt. The danger of the Victorian bakery was not concentrated in one moment. It stretched itself thin across days and years. Smoke was constant, not thick enough to demand evacuation, not light enough to ignore. It lived in the lungs, patiently. Coal burned steadily. It released gases that had no interest in human schedules. Carbon monoxide did not announce itself. It softened consciousness gently. It invited rest at inappropriate times. Some bakers collapsed near ovens. Others leaned against walls and slid downward without sound. The room did not notice immediately. It was accustomed to stillness. There were stories of explosions, but most danger arrived quietly. The baker coughed, he rested, he worked again. Over time, breathing became optional rather than assumed. Accidents with machinery increased as bakeries modernized slightly. Mixers existed, but safety did not. Sleeves caught, balance failed. Someone shouted, someone did not. Work resumed. Apprentices were especially vulnerable. Their bodies were smaller. Their experience was thinner. They learned by watching and by making mistakes that sometimes mattered too much. No system tracked these losses carefully. Names disappeared into parish records or were remembered briefly by neighbors. The bakery hired again. The oven stayed hot. There is a subdued irony in how calmly these dangers were accepted. The public feared hunger more than fire. Fire destroyed buildings, hunger destroyed people, so bakeries reopened even after burning. Walls blackened, floors replaced. The oven rebuilt slightly off-center. No one expected perfection, they expected bread. Insurance was rare. Protection was personal. If the bakery burned, the baker borrowed. If he could not, he vanished into another trade or another street. The neighborhood did not protest frequent fires. Smoke was part of the city. Smells blended. Everything burned somewhere. Bread, meanwhile, remained comforting. It arrived warm. It cracked pleasantly. It distracted from the knowledge that its birthplace was unstable. This contradiction held. People trusted the product more than the process. They always have. The baker understood risk intimately, even if he did not name it. He felt it in lungs that resisted deep breaths, in hands that shook briefly near flame, in the constant awareness that one misstep could end the day permanently. Yet he returned every morning because risk did not remove obligation. Obligation created its own gravity. The bakery did not push back violently. It applied pressure slowly, patiently, until bodies gave way. History rarely pauses for these moments. It records reforms later. It records numbers. It rarely records breath. When historians later looked back, they called these conditions unsafe. They listed causes. They proposed solutions. From a distance, everything appears correctable. Up close, survival rarely allows redesign. The Victorian bakery existed at the intersection of necessity and neglect. Fire was required, flour was combustible, wood was cheap. None of this felt negotiable. Bread pushed back not because it wanted to, but because systems under strain eventually respond. Floors burned, ovens cracked, lungs filled, bodies stopped. Yet the city did not stop. The demand for bread did not soften out of respect. Mornings still arrived. Hunger still knocked. There is a quiet cruelty in how unremarkable these deaths felt at the time. A baker gone was unfortunate but replaceable. A bakery burned was inconvenient but rebuildable. No monuments marked these losses, no speeches followed, only continuity. The baker did not expect safety, he expected fatigue. That expectation shaped behavior. If danger felt normal, it did not deserve alarm. Even fires that destroyed entire shops were sometimes framed as bad luck rather than warning. Luck absolves systems. It removes responsibility. And so bread continued to push back, gently, consistently, through physics and chemistry rather than intention. It reminded humans that ignoring reality does not prevent consequence. Eventually change would come, regulations, inspections, materials replaced, ventilation improved. But that future had not arrived yet. Here, in this chapter, bread remains slightly hostile, not evil, just honest. The bakery at night cooled slowly. Ash settled. The oven slept. Rats adjusted paths around scorched boards. Morning would begin again. The baker, if alive, would return. If not, another would take his place. The system did not grieve, it functioned. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. Not the fires, not the deaths, but the calm continuation. History rarely stops to apologize. It moves forward, collecting lessons only after enough bodies have paid for them. Bread pushed back, quietly, persistently, and the city learned, slowly, what it had been willing to ignore. Chapter 7. Apprenticeship. When childhood became a tool. In Victorian England, childhood did not end suddenly. It thinned, it faded, it was gradually replaced by usefulness. For many children, the bakery was where that replacement became official. A boy of 10 entered the bakehouse not to learn a craft, in the romantic sense. He entered because small bodies fit where large ones could not. He entered because someone needed to wake earlier than adults already did. He entered because hunger respects no age. There was no ceremony, no welcome, no explanation of the future. A child arrived, usually brought by a parent who had done the same arithmetic everyone did. One mouth fewer to feed at home meant one more loaf somewhere else. The apprentice learned quickly that learning was not the point, obedience was. Strength came later, silence came first. He lit the oven before dawn, hands numb, eyes still searching for sleep. He carried sacks of flour that leaned into him like stubborn animals. He swept floors that were never clean long enough to reward effort. He learned where not to stand when sparks leapt, and when to step back without being told. Sleep happened wherever it could. Often it happened near the oven, where warmth was strongest and air was worst. The child slept lightly, trained by noise and expectation. At any moment, he could be needed. Mistakes were not framed as lessons. They were framed as inconveniences, a burned loaf, a spilled tray, a missed cue. Each error was absorbed by the child's shoulders quietly, without discussion. No one called this exploitation. That word belonged to later centuries with more distance. In Victorian language, this was opportunity. The child was learning a trade. He was earning his keep. He was lucky. There is a dry irony here, gentle enough to survive telling. At least he was indoors. At least he was warm. At least he was not underground or inside a chimney. Victorian standards had a talent for reframing hardship until gratitude seemed appropriate. The apprentice's body adapted quickly. It had to. Bones adjusted to weight. Lungs adjusted to dust. Fatigue became normal. Play became theoretical. Childhood did not disappear entirely. It hid. It surfaced in brief moments. A joke whispered while carrying flour, a stolen crust eaten too fast, a laugh that escaped before exhaustion caught it. But mostly childhood waited. It waited for a time when work might ease. It waited for a future that was always described but rarely reached. The bakery accepted the child without sentiment. It needed hands. It received them. Everything else was incidental. Apprenticeship in the bakery was not structured progression. It was endurance disguised as training. Days did not build toward mastery. They repeated until the body understood them without instruction. The child learned by watching, by copying, by being corrected sharply. Praise was rare, efficiency was expected. He learned that fatigue was not a reason to stop. It was proof that work was happening. He learned that hunger could be postponed. He learned that discomfort did not require comment. Adults did not intend to be cruel. They were tired themselves. Compassion requires surplus, and surplus was rare. The bakery did not create tenderness. It consumed it. The apprentice absorbed the language of work early. He learned which noises meant urgency, which silences meant danger, which expressions meant he had failed again. His education was physical before it was mental. He learned angles, weights, temperatures. He learned how to move quickly without colliding, how to disappear into corners when tempers rose. Formal schooling faded quickly. Letters and numbers mattered less than timing and balance. Knowledge that did not improve output became optional. Parents rarely intervened. They had made the same trade once. To object would have been to question survival itself. There is another quiet irony here. Apprenticeship was supposed to protect children from the worst forms of labor. In theory, it offered shelter and skill. In practice, it offered continuity. The child slept near heat because heat was reliable. He ate what was left because leftovers existed. He learned that security did not mean comfort. It meant predictability. In moments of exhaustion, the bakery felt endless. In moments of calm, it felt almost safe. These perceptions shifted hour by hour. Occasionally, a child did not adapt. He became ill. He grew weak. He disappeared. No announcement followed. Another arrived. The system did not require intention to harm. It functioned on replacement. The apprentice did not imagine himself as exploited. He imagined himself as necessary. That belief carried him through days that would have otherwise been unbearable. This is how systems sustain themselves. They teach participants to identify with function rather than self. Looking back, it is tempting to grieve for these children loudly. But grief, like outrage, belongs to observers with time. Inside the bakery, emotion was a luxury that interfered with rhythm. The apprentice grew older quietly. His body thickened. His movements smoothed. He became less visible and more useful. This transition was considered success. One day he corrected a younger child sharply. The sound surprised him. Then it felt familiar. This is not betrayal, it is inheritance. The bakery did not destroy childhood in a single act. It wore it down through repetition, through nights that ended early, through mornings that began before light. There were moments of kindness, a hand steadying a sack, a loaf set aside, a word spoken softer than usual. These moments mattered. They did not change the structure. Eventually, the apprentice became a baker, or he left, or his body failed. All outcomes were accepted. Victorian society praised resilience without asking what resilience cost. Children learned this lesson early. In later years, reforms would come. Age limits, inspections, rules written down. Childhood would become something to preserve rather than spend. But here in this chapter, childhood is still currency. It is exchanged for warmth, food, and the promise of continuity. The bakery closes for the night. The child sleeps near the oven again. Tomorrow will arrive whether he is ready or not. History rarely pauses to apologize. It records improvement after endurance has done its work. The apprentice breathes slowly. The oven cools. The city rests, unaware of how young its bread makers are. And somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, childhood waits patiently, hoping to be remembered later. Chapter 8: When Society Began to Doubt the Loaf. One quiet morning, somewhere between habit and accident, someone finally paused long enough to notice that bread, which had always been trusted as the most dependable object on the table, was leaving behind questions that did not dissolve with chewing, because children complained of stomach pains that lingered without fever. Dogs sniffed loaves and turned away, as if instinct had learned something humans refused to articulate, and pale faces appeared in households that ate well but did not look nourished. And at first these observations floated separately, disconnected, treated as coincidence or personal weakness. Yet repetition has a way of softening denial, and slowly, almost reluctantly, society began to wonder whether the whiteness of bread signaled purity or concealment, whether smooth crusts hid rough truths, and whether the daily loaf might be less a gift and more a gamble, a realization that did not arrive with outrage or banners, but with quiet unease, whispered conversations, and the uncomfortable awareness that something ordinary had begun behaving in ways that ordinary things should not, especially when fed to children. The doubt did not bloom loudly because Victorian society preferred stability over clarity, and asking questions about bread meant questioning systems that fed cities, employed thousands, and kept hunger just barely at bay. So suspicion moved slowly, wrapped in politeness and scientific curiosity rather than accusation, as doctors noted patterns without conclusions, pamphlets suggested possibilities without certainty, and households adjusted behavior subtly, changing bakers, diluting meals, or simply eating less with the hope that moderation might succeed, where understanding had not yet arrived, while officials hesitated, aware that regulation would require responsibility, and responsibility required admitting that harm had been normalized for years, perhaps decades, under the comforting assumption that familiarity equaled safety, an assumption now thinning, like childhood once did, into something quieter and less reliable. There was a gentle irony embedded in this moment, dry enough to pass unnoticed at first, because society did not accuse bread of wrongdoing. It accused bodies of reacting incorrectly, and when discomfort followed meals, explanations leaned toward temperament, digestion, or moral weakness, anything except the loaf itself. And yet the questions persisted, not because people wished to disrupt routine, but because repetition had begun to contradict reassurance, and slowly, without speeches or revolutions, suspicion settled into public consciousness, creating the earliest space where reform might someday enter, not triumphantly, but apologetically, as if aware that it had arrived late to a table where consequences had already been served. When regulation finally appeared, it did not arrive as salvation, but as paperwork, tentative and underpowered, carrying language that suggested concern without committing to confrontation, because the first food safety laws were written by people aware that too much force could collapse systems faster than hunger ever could, and so they chose caution, crafting rules that hinted rather than commanded, laws that could be interpreted generously, enforced rarely, and ignored politely, allowing society to claim progress while changing as little as possible, which, in a strange way, mirrored the rhythm of bread itself, slow to rise, slow to transform, slow to reveal, whether effort would ever justify expectation. Inspectors existed, but not in sufficient numbers, and their presence felt more symbolic than corrective, a nod toward responsibility rather than its full embrace, as they stepped into bakeries, noted conditions, frowned thoughtfully, and departed with reports that traveled slowly through offices where urgency softened into administration, while bakers adjusted just enough to appear compliant, cleaning surfaces briefly, storing ingredients differently for a day, and then returning to routine once observation passed, because routine was resilient and systems rarely surrender to rules that threaten survival without offering alternatives that feel equally reliable. Still, something shifted, subtly but permanently, because even weak laws introduce language, and language introduces possibility. And once people could name adulteration, contamination, and risk, they could no longer pretend that discomfort was entirely imaginary. And though enforcement lagged and consequences remained uneven, the idea that bread might be accountable began to circulate, gently unsettling the long-standing agreement that nourishment need not explain itself. An idea that did not fix bakeries overnight, but quietly altered expectations, preparing society, slowly and imperfectly, to accept that safety might someday be considered as necessary as fullness. Change, when it finally took hold, did so without ceremony, without gratitude, and without apology, because history rarely revisits those it inconvenienced along the way, and instead moved forward carrying lessons learned at the cost of countless unnamed bodies, reforming systems incrementally until danger felt distant enough to forget, and bread, once a game of chance, disguised as routine, became something closer to predictable, regulated, and dull, which in this context was victory, though no one called it that aloud, preferring instead to enjoy meals without reflection, grateful not for safety, but for silence. The irony resting quietly beneath this progress is that reform succeeded precisely because it was unremarkable, because it did not demand remembrance, statues, or gratitude, only compliance. And as bakeries grew cleaner, laws grew stronger, and childhood was slowly removed from the most dangerous corners of labor, society congratulated itself without lingering on how long doubt had been dismissed, how many signs had been ignored, or how patience had once been praised as virtue when it was merely endurance mislabeled for comfort. And so the story settles gently, without triumph, because the goal was never heroism, only the removal of roulette from breakfast. And in that sense, reform accomplished exactly what it promised. Not perfection, not justice, but the quiet reduction of risk, allowing bread to return to being boring, dependable, and mostly invisible again, which may be the highest compliment history ever offers to objects that once demanded suffering, because when danger fades into routine safety, remembrance softens, and sleep arrives more easily, carrying with it the unspoken agreement that some lessons are best honored not by repetition, but by never needing to be learned again. Chapter 9. When bread became bread again. Bread today does not glow under candlelight, and this alone would have seemed miraculous to someone standing in a Victorian kitchen 2 centuries ago, not because light itself was strange, but because the absence of it meant something had quietly gone right. That whiteness was no longer manufactured through powders borrowed from walls and bones. That softness came from grain rather than chemistry, and that the loaf resting on the table had returned to being what it always pretended to be, an object so ordinary it no longer required explanation, defense, or courage to consume. And this ordinariness, often overlooked, is not a triumph of innovation but of restraint, the slow agreement that food should not surprise the body after swallowing, a modest ambition by modern standards, yet one achieved only after generations accepted that harm was simply part of breakfast. The modern bakery does not ask its workers to wake before the city out of fear that delay might cause suffering, nor does it hide itself underground as if ashamed of its own processes. And while exhaustion still exists and labor is never gentle, the room itself no longer behaves like a quiet adversary. Because heat is measured, air moves with intention, and surfaces are cleaned, not to impress inspectors but to avoid harm. A distinction that matters more than it sounds, since it signals a shift from appearance to consequence, from what looks safe to what actually is, and this shift did not arrive with applause but with paperwork, arguments, and the slow normalization of expectations that would have sounded absurdly idealistic to a Victorian baker who had learned to accept risk as an ingredient. There is a soft irony in how unremarkable this transformation feels now, because safety rarely announces itself when it finally settles in, preferring instead to disappear into routine so that bread once again becomes invisible, a background object rather than a calculation, and people eat without wondering whether the loaf is testing them, without pausing to inspect color, smell, or texture for signs of deception. And this ease, this absence of vigilance, is perhaps the most profound evidence that something has changed, that bread has returned to being boring, dependable, and undeserving of suspicion, which is not an insult, but a compliment. History rarely grants without extracting payment first. The transformation of bread did not occur because humanity suddenly became wiser, kinder, or more ethical, but because inconvenience accumulated until indifference could no longer absorb it, and stomach pains became patterns, and illnesses became statistics, and children's bodies became evidence that could not be politely dismissed forever, forcing societies to confront the uncomfortable possibility that tradition was not neutral, that habit could harm without intending to, and that feeding people was not the same as nourishing them, a realization that arrived not as moral awakening but as administrative necessity, because once harm could be measured, it demanded response, even from systems built to move slowly. Laws followed reluctantly, shaped more by compromise than conviction, and implemented unevenly because every regulation threatened an economy that had grown comfortable balancing risk against profit. Yet even imperfect laws changed language, and language reshaped expectations, until bakers were no longer asked merely to produce loaves, but to account for them, to explain their ingredients, their storage, their cleanliness, and this expectation alone altered behavior, not because bakers had suddenly become different people, but because systems respond to what is required of them. And once safety became a requirement rather than a suggestion, bread began its quiet return to normality. It is important to notice how late this decision arrived, how long it took for society to agree on something that now feels self-evident, that food probably should not injure those who rely on it. And this lateness is not an anomaly but a pattern, because history often waits until damage has proven itself undeniable before acting, preferring endurance over prevention and calling patience a virtue even when it functions as neglect. And in this sense, modern bread is not evidence of progress alone, but of delay, a reminder that what feels natural now once required suffering to become obvious. Every safe loaf eaten today carries no warning, no residue, no story printed on its crust, and this silence is intentional because modern bread is designed to disappear into daily life, not to demand attention or reflection. Yet beneath that silence lies memory, quiet and uninsistent, of people who worked in heat that had no mercy, who breathed air that offered no forgiveness, and who accepted conditions they did not choose because alternatives were worse. And these people are not commemorated in bakeries or laws, but in the absence of risk, in the absence of glow, in the absence of fear. The Victorian baker did not imagine this future, not because he lacked hope, but because imagining safety required distance from danger, and distance was something he never had, and so his work continued within limits defined by survival rather than vision. While history moved forward slowly, carrying his labor without carrying his name, and when bread finally became bread again, simple and unremarkable, it did so without acknowledging those who had not lived long enough to see it, a common outcome in stories where improvement arrives after endurance has done its work. This chapter is not an ending because normality is not a conclusion, but a condition that must be maintained, and bread remains ordinary only as long as decisions continue to favor consequence over convenience, and as long as society remembers, even faintly, that safety is not automatic but chosen, often late, often reluctantly, and always after someone else has already paid the price. And so when the narrator lowers their voice here, slowing the rhythm, it is not to mourn dramatically, but to acknowledge quietly that every harmless meal is a small act of inheritance received without effort, sustained without gratitude, and made possible by people who endured a version of bread that was not content to remain harmless. Final habit: when people forget that everything was once dangerous. Habit is a quiet achievement. It does not announce itself, and it does not ask to be admired. It simply settles in gently until danger feels fictional and effort feels unnecessary. Most people today do not think about bread. They do not inspect it. They do not hesitate before eating it. They trust it the way one trusts gravity or sleep, not because they understand it deeply, but because it has not failed them recently. This trust is not ignorance. It is inheritance. Bread has become boring again, and boredom is the final stage of safety. When something no longer needs explanation, no longer requires vigilance, no longer invites suspicion, it has been absorbed into routine. Routine is where history goes to rest. Yet routine is also where memory fades. At some point, people stopped noticing that food could be dangerous, not because danger vanished completely, but because systems became good enough to hide it, good enough to reduce risk to something statistical, good enough to push fear out of the daily conversation. The table grew quiet. Meals no longer carried questions. Stomachs no longer negotiated with chemistry. Children no longer learned caution through pain. And so, gradually, the past loosened its grip. We forget that bread once demanded courage, that it once required calculation, that eating was not a neutral act, but a compromise with systems that valued speed, appearance, and endurance over consequence. We forget because forgetting is comfortable, and comfort is persuasive. The baker no longer lives beneath the street. The oven no longer behaves like a creature. The flour no longer carries secrets meant for walls instead of bodies. And because of this, modern life moves smoothly. Breakfast arrives without history attached. Lunch tastes like routine. Dinner closes the day without reflection. This is not failure. It is success with a side effect. The side effect is amnesia. When danger retreats, it takes its lessons with it. What remains is habit. And habit, while useful, does not remember who paid for it. Most people do not need to know how fragile normality once was in order to enjoy it. But history remembers anyway, quietly, without insisting. It remembers basements, it remembers smoke, it remembers small hands, learning to lift weights they should never have carried. It remembers because forgetting was never its job. There is no moral here that demands attention, no instruction to change your life, no call to gratitude that requires emotion. This is not that kind of ending. It is simply an observation, spoken softly enough not to disturb sleep. The safest parts of modern life are the ones we think about the least. Not because they are trivial, but because they have been stabilized by invisible labor, long arguments, late reforms, and people who did not live long enough to benefit from them. Bread is one of those things. It does not glow anymore. It does not taste like chalk. It does not arrive carrying rodents, powders, or quiet bets with fate, not because humanity became noble, but because eventually humanity became tired of consequences. And that is often how progress happens. Not through enlightenment, but through accumulation. Not through ideals, but through exhaustion with harm. The people who worked in Victorian bakeries did not imagine themselves as part of a historical process. They imagined tomorrow. They imagined rest. They imagined surviving another day. They did not demand remembrance. They did not expect thanks. They simply worked inside conditions that history later decided were unacceptable. And now those conditions are gone or softened or regulated into dullness, which is exactly the point. This ending does not close a story. It lets it fade into normality where it belongs. because the true mark of safety is not celebration. It is silence. So tonight, as you listen, as the rhythm slows and the details loosen their grip, you are not being asked to remember everything, only to understand that forgetting was earned. That habit, while quiet, is not accidental, and that ordinary things are often ordinary only because something difficult came before them. Bread is bread again, and that is enough. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying awake long enough to drift back into sleep. Where history softens, habits hold, and nothing needs to be dangerous anymore. Good night.